Welcome to Parallax by Ankur Kalra, a podcast produced by Radcliffe Cardiology to bring you a new angle of all things cardiology and the best from the US Cardiology Review. Published every second Monday, Ankur Kalra, MD, interventional cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic in Ohio, USA, speaks with legendary cardiologists, reviews late-breaking trials, and interviews authors of our latest and best US Cardiology Review articles. We call them #audio articles. Parallax is the effect whereby the position or direction of an object appears to differ when viewed from different positions. So this podcast is your fix of reliable updates on all things cardiology by someone from a non-traditional background who is always looking at the industry from a new angle. Now, here's your host, Ankur Kalra, MD.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Parallax. This is another special episode for me. I've been trying to get him on the show. It's been over a month, because of, his schedule and my schedule. It's been a little challenging, but, nonetheless, here we are now. And I'm very happy that we've both been able to, make time for this episode and what I feel will be an incredible episode. So without much further ado, I have with me on the show Dr. Chuck Simonton. And Dr. Simonton is the Vice President of Global Medical Affairs and Chief Medical Officer at Abiomed. Chuck, welcome on the show, and thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks, Ankur. I'm happy to be here.
So let's begin by just discussing a little bit about early influences in life for you. Childhood, early adulthood, what led you into a path in medicine, and then we're going to talk about training in internal medicine, and then general cardiology, and then interventional cardiology. But why don't we start with, early influences in life?
Sure. I think everybody has a story to tell in this regard as to how they ended up in medicine. And we all somehow end up here through oftentimes very different paths. Mine was a little unusual in that a lot of kids go to college not knowing what they want to do. I knew from the very beginning as a freshman at UNC Chapel Hill that I wanted to be a physician. And the influence probably came mostly from a combination of my father and some of my friends' dads growing up. So my father was a Methodist minister. And at that time, the Methodist Church in North Carolina moved me around about every 5 years. And so I had to make new friends every 5 years. But my dad, which was a socializing, I think, influence on me growing up. But my dad also included me in a lot of things like hospital visits, where he would sit at the bedside of some of his parishioners who were suffering from life-threatening illness or were dying. And then I also saw him as a leader. And I think the combination of that compassion for people and his leadership was part of the inspiration. And then I had one of my best friends in high school. His father was a physician, and I loved hanging out at his house and getting to know his dad. And I always liked science. I mean, I was kind of a science and math nerd early on. So I thought, okay, I like science and math, but also like people. And I want to be around people. So I don't think I want to be a PhD researcher. I think I'd like to combine science with people, and medicine seems like the way to go. And that's kind of, I guess, the childhood growing up influences that got me there. And I knew pretty well by the time I started as a freshman at UNC that I wanted to be a doctor and start becoming pre-med and heading to medical school. And then I just had very fortunate to have some very good mentors, even in college. So I was, of course, as a minister, I had to go on work study to make money to pay my tuition and room and board. And so I started working in the research lab of a cardiologist who ran the cardiology division at UNC Chapel Hill, Ellis Rolette. And Ellis was widely known for his work in muscle mechanics. So I learned how to hang papillary muscles, rabbit papillary muscles, and do contractility experiments even as an undergraduate in college. And also I guess my other role model there was a professor that I looked up to in analytical chemistry. I was a chemistry major. And those two individuals really inspired me outside of just the usual classwork at UNC to think bigger and do other things. And Ellis was a Harvard Medical School graduate back in the 1950s. And when I got ready to apply to med school, he said, you've done really well here at Carolina. I think you should consider applying to a lot of good med schools. And I think between his letter and Maurice Bursey, who was my analytical chemistry professor, who I did a lot of lab work with as well, those letters, plus I guess some decent grades, I was able to get into Harvard Medical School. And that, I think, as a North Carolina boy, that's when my world exploded. That's when I met people from all over the world, actually, in the Harvard community, which changed the way I thought about the world and the way I thought about medicine and science. So there you have it in the early years. And then after medical school, ended up matching for residency at UCSF and was University of California, San Francisco program at Moffitt Hospital. It's a fantastic program at the time. There were some guys out there that I didn't know they were all going to become who they became, but names like Eric Topol and Rob Califf, who were both a couple of years ahead of me in the program, were already there. The guy who was a year or two ahead of me at Harvard Medical School there, a guy named Paul Yock, who, as you know, invented the Yock patent for rapid exchange balloon angioplasty catheters in the 1990s, and then went on to do a lot of work in intravascular ultrasound and founded the School of Biodesign at Stanford. Was there at the time. He said, Chuck, you got to come out here. This place is great. So I ended up at UCSF, and with those kinds of colleagues paving the way and teaching me along the way, including also Dean Kariakis, as many people know Dean, of course, who's in Cincinnati now with the Lender Foundation, that he's running clinical trials for years and editor of Circulation. These are the kind of people that I was fortunate enough to get to work with. And that group, after leaving that, I came back to Duke for cardiology fellowship, and that's when angioplasty was really hitting. This was in the mid to late 80s, and through Richard Stack and Harry Phillips and the team at Duke got really interested in angioplasty. I thought I was going to be a heart failure doc. Actually, in my first year at Duke, I did a bunch of heart failure research. And then all the stuff started happening over at Duke, Maine, in the cath lab. And I just had to get in there. And angioplasty was just too attractive to be able to actually actually fix people, do something that would make a difference immediately. That immediate gratification of taking people with acute MI at that time. We were even doing acute MI angioplasty in the early years at Duke, flying people in on the helicopter. And all we had was a balloon catheter at the time. This was 1989, 1990. And then beginning, clinical studies in angioplasty, and then rotational atherectomy, directional atherectomy, excimer laser. These things all happened before we had a stent. And then finally, of course, the FDA approval of the Paul Manchat stent, which is the first really truly deliverable stent for primary angioplasty in 1995 in the U.S. And then the multi-link stent came quickly behind it and took most of the market share in 1998 in the U.S. And then, as you know, that was the beginning of really the explosion of interventional cardiology with drug-eluting stents in the early 2000s. And at that point, I had left Duke and moved to Charlotte and joined a large group called the Sanger Clinic. This was in 1989 by the time I was there. And started the interventional program there. And when all we had was a balloon when I left Duke. And then lived through all the clinical trials, started the research group there, the clinical trials group. From all the stuff I'd learned from Rob Califf and Dan Mark and the guys at Duke who had taught me about clinical research, clinical trials, and epidemiology, and just had a great time taking a high-volume clinic like the Sanger Clinic that did not have a lot of clinical research yet, and using that patient population to really learn and enroll in clinical trials, and just over 20 years building that program and doing a regional meeting every year in June. I started a meeting called Advanced Cardiovascular Interventions Meeting, ACI meeting, which happened every June in Hilton Head, South Carolina. We had all the major international faculty come through there. Week-long meeting in complex coronary and peripheral intervention. And then, of course, I was doing live cases out of Charlotte for TCT and other meetings. And after doing that and doing a lot of work with industry over the years, a guy named John Capek contacted me, and we had lunch at one TCT, and he said, Chuck, it looks like Guidant, which was one of the most successful angioplasty companies, as you may remember, in the late 90s, early 2000s, would look like it was going to be acquired. They had kind of missed the drug-eluting stent first wave that Boston Scientific and Cordis had captured, but they had a really fast follower stent called the Xiant stent that was going to come to market in 2008, and they needed a chief medical officer. Guidant angioplasty business was acquired by Abbott, and that's what created Abbott Vascular. So I became the first chief medical officer for Abbott Vascular in 2008, and became an industry guy.
Yeah. So no, well, it's incredible pedigree and incredible background, and your. I was listening to your description of childhood and early adulthood, and some incredible influences from family, and then you brought on to medicine, and those names are not those names are pretty heavy lifters in academic cardiovascular medicine, as we know. I mean, Bob Califf and Eric Topol and Dean Kariakis, and those are some of the names that you mentioned, and and Dan Mark, and they're all still at these academic medical institutions. I mean, we know Dr. Califf was the former FDA commissioner. Dr. Topol is at Scripps, was at the Cleveland Clinic before he moved to Scripps, and then Dan Mark, I believe, is still at Duke. But just if you can, just because a lot of our audience are early career cardiologists and and maybe fellows in training or residents, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how it was to work with these luminaries. For example, Dean Kariakis or Dan Mark, or even Eric Topol, Bob Califf. How was it as a fellow, because you were a fellow in Duke, so maybe your interactions with Bob and Dan happened when you were at Duke. So maybe as a fellow, how was it? Were they approachable? What were some of the conversations you had? What were some of the
I think
moments that you still remember when you reminisce your time at Duke?
Either coming up in whatever field, but since we're talking about cardiology, whether it's interventional cardiology or heart failure or a structural heart cardiologist, since we're mainly talking about cardiology, but these comments would apply to almost any fellowship or any early career experience. My advice would be to be very observant of who the leaders are in the institutions where you train. Faculty that are forward-looking, cutting edge, presenting at the big meetings, doing research that results in late-breaking clinical trial presentations at the big meetings. That's who you want to attach your boat to. And Duke was fairly rich with that when I was a fellow there in the late 80s, because it was a lot was happening in cardiology. Interventional cardiology there were no interventional cardiology fellowships back then. It was just cardiologists doing cardiology fellowships that were then learning in the cath lab how to do balloon angioplasty, and being a part of the clinical data that was being developed at the time to justify what we were doing as opposed to bypass surgery. And particularly for acute MI at the time, Duke became a big center. We had 2 helicopters going around the clock 24/7, bringing patients in with acute MI from the rural areas of North Carolina, who at that time were getting streptokinase. We were doing emergency balloon angioplasty, and ultimately that changed, of course, to TPA. And then we got into all of the big studies subsequently. And this is after I left Duke and went down to Charlotte to the Sanger Clinic when the study started on STEMI like PAMI and stent PAMI, which actually resulted in TIMI-2B, which actually resulted in the studies that defined primary angioplasty as superior to thrombolytic therapy for acute myocardial infarction. And today, I'm sure you young folks listening now are going, well, obviously primary angioplasty is better than giving TPA, but at the time, that was totally unknown. And there were lots of proponents that you had to get a thrombolytic into the patient. You couldn't delay doing that for 2 hours, 3 hours for a helicopter transport or something and not give the patient any lytics and just wait to open it up with a balloon. But Bill O'Neill in Detroit and a guy named Bruce Brody in Greensboro had very good single center registry showing that their patients were doing terrific. They were avoiding intracranial hemorrhage and other bleeding complications occurring due to thrombolytics, and the patients' outcomes were great. And that's what those were the pilots that stimulated the randomized trials that follow on primary angioplasty and stenting once stents came around versus thrombolytics. So I would say, I guess that story is about hitching your wagon or your boat to the leaders that you are working with. For me at Duke, it was Richard Stack and Rob Califf and Harry Phillips, who was more of the private practice guy, who was really building the practice and teaching me how to talk to referring physicians and how to encourage referrals so you could build the practice. That's what Harry did well. Richard was the research guy. Richard Stack was doing a ton of research on stent designs in the animal lab and then trying to do translational. We didn't even call it translational research back then, but that's what we were doing with research going on in conjunction with companies like ACS, which became Guidant, and had a lot of the very successful early bare metal stents in the late 90s that we were doing research on stent design, stent deliverability throughout the early 1990s. So I think that's what I would say, Ankur, is just whatever institution you're at, if you're at a good program, every program has a leader and every program has people who are cutting edge. If they're not, I would suggest try to change programs, try to get into a program where you see leaders, forward-looking thinkers, people doing clinical research or product development in conjunction with industry engineers, to get where those people are, because they're going to teach you how to think independently, how to get out of some of the conservative ways that we tend to get comfortable with, and always be challenging yourself and improving.
Yes, no, excellent points. And, I'm sure some of the residents or fellows in training or, even early career interventionalists like myself who are listening are, gaining a lot of insights from your experience and, from what you've lived through. I want to touch base a little bit on your, time spent at Sanger Clinic, because, I think when you were, talking about your experience at Sanger Clinic, I picked up on it because when I came in through to the Cleveland Clinic Health System, I started out at Akron General, which is, one of the regional hospitals for Cleveland Clinic. And we're doing, obviously there's a busy STEMI program, and, I was helping my colleague to develop a structural heart program, which he's leading, but also, entrusted with the responsibility of, starting a clinical research enterprise at one of the clinic's regional hospitals. And, so for me, and I'm sure there are many like me who are in similar shoes or, at the same stage in their career right now, is, trying to start a clinical research program which is vibrant, which is active in a place which is busy clinically but has not really forayed into clinical research. So and you sort of you've had a myriad of experiences, very rich ones, which have obviously translated into who you are today. But I think for someone like myself, and I'm sure there are many like me in their early career stage who want to be, good clinicians, but also really good clinician scientists, what would be some of the, both pitfalls, challenges, and then also advantages of a place, which is busy clinically, but hasn't really forayed into research and is looking for a leader or is looking for a person who can fit into that role and,
really
get that going? What would be some of your insights?
I can just tell you kind of how I got started when I moved down to the Sanger Clinic, as you mentioned. So I left a highly sophisticated, well-developed clinical research institution like Duke, where we had clinical research nurses, we had physician assistants assigned to screening and enrolling patients, a real strong infrastructure, down to the Sanger Clinic, which is as you described where you were. Sanger Clinic was very, very busy clinically, doing great work. And actually, preceding me, there were several physicians there that had left very high-ranking faculty positions where they were. As a matter of fact, John Gallagher had been there for a couple of years. John Gallagher is basically the guy who published all the early work on mapping WPW for WPW ablation procedures, and had a tenured faculty position at Duke, and decided he wanted to be more independent and left and had been at the Sanger Clinic for a number of years before I came. So that was the caliber of physicians in this group. Other than John, though, there wasn't much clinical research or innovation going on the interventional side because it was just starting. I mean, this is the late 80s. Balloon angioplasty was just kind of starting to catch on outside of the academic places that were early on. They were doing angioplasty at the Sanger Clinic, but not really involved in trials. So the way you get started, the way I got started, I recommend if you are at a place that is not doing this yet, is to approach the large companies like Abbott, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, Abiomed, and others, Cordis with Cardinal, and there's a number of them that are currently developing products and wanting to enroll patients. And the first step is to get involved in a registry. You're not going to all of a sudden be invited to start enrolling patients in a pivotal randomized trial by a company that's trying to get a device approved. That's a pretty high level of clinical trial participation. So start off by saying, hey, look, I've got a lot of ST elevation in my patients that come in here. Or I do a lot of high-risk PCI. We're very skilled, and we'd like to get involved in some studies and offer up the opportunity to contribute patients to a registry, either a post-approval registry or any other kind of registries that the companies are trying to do. Because they will come in, they'll do a visit and say, well, what clinical trial infrastructure do you have? And you got to start somewhere. You can say, well, we have a nurse that works here who's had clinical trial experience before at another institution, and we could get her started. And we could start with something simple like a post-approval registry. And then what you do is you prove yourself by enrolling a lot of patients in that, because companies like to enroll fast, and they like to go to hospitals that can enroll a lot of patients quickly with high quality. And that gets you on the map. They go, wow, okay, boy, this guy, this man or woman, this physician is in a great place, smart, has one or two good clinical research nurses, did a great job in this first registry. Let's step it up and let's see if they can get involved in some more of our studies. And then other companies find out about that too, not just the company you start with. This is a very small community. The word will get out that you can enroll patients in certain categories where you're strong, the kinds of patients that you have. But start at the registry level. You can reach out to the big companies, find out what they're doing, and get in with a simple type of participation like a registry, and then work your way up. But volume's important, and speed of enrollment's important, but also obviously quality, because all these studies are audited by the FDA, or most of them are.
Yeah, no, those are great insights, and I think a good segue into my next question. So no, thank you for vividly describing the process of getting started at a place which is clinically busy and is wanting to get feet wet in clinical research. I think those are incredible insights from someone like yourself. But what I was saying initially was that this was a great segue into my next question, which is so from Sanger Clinic, which is where you were, was that your last stop? Was that your last, your initial, I think, appointment out of fellowship, and that's where you were. I mean, you were very successful in that role. And then was that then the last stop before you forwarded into industry? Because you said that it was 2008, I believe. When did that that transition occurred? How far advanced into your clinical practice? Like how many years out of fellowship, and how many years were you practicing in
So I've been
that
at the
role
Sanger
before you
Clinic
decided to move on to
about
industry?
20 years, just under 20 years when I made the decision. And it came at a time when, I'd done so much clinical research and a lot of education, and all of that, most of that, of course, is sponsored by industry. It also consulted with companies on device development. They'd come in and say, okay, we're working on a certain stent design, or we're working on a certain atherectomy, a change in the rotational atherectomy cutter delivery system or something. And I would do a lot of that kind of consulting and advisory boards with industry. And I liked industry. I liked the sales organization. I liked how we advance in interventional cardiology is almost entirely due to relationships we have with industry. So despite what a lot of people say out there, some of the, more academic pundits about how there are these physician industry conflicts of interest and how we treat our patients. The fact of the matter is we don't need less interaction between physicians and industry. We need more, because the more industry talks to physicians, the better the products are that they develop, and the more physicians can influence healthcare. There's only so much money coming from the NIH, which I guess would be considered totally academically independent, non-industry, quote unquote, tainted research funding. And that's for pretty early studies and very experimental types of programs, or really big clinical trials like Courage or like the ischemia trial, the big ones that NIH tends to fund, that are huge clinical questions, or they're very early experimental types of study. But for the most part, if you look at interventional cardiology, the tools that we have, everything from the balloon angioplasty to stents to TAVR to the MitraClip to the left atrial appendage occlusion devices, ASD occluders, PFO occluders, all the electrophysiology equipment that's used for mapping and ablation, all of that was developed through industry research, and physicians being very close on advisory boards, helping industry understand what the needs are. So we need even more of that. The FDA is very interested in accelerating innovation in the U.S., and they're looking for ways to do that safely. And so, now the early feasibility study program is opened up in the U.S. where a company can do its first in man patient. For instance, now we didn't finish my personal story that I left Abbott and I'm now the CMO at Abiomed. But Abiomed has a new pump for high-risk supported PCI that will be 9 French in diameter, so a much smaller French than any other pump on the market. And they're going to do their first in man, not in Europe, not in South America, like has been done by so many companies in the past, including Abiomed and Abbott and all of them. But it's going to happen right here in the U.S. The first patient will be treated in the world here in the U.S. before the end of the year, because the company is committed to the promise of the FDA that they want to encourage first-in-man work in the U.S. so that they can understand the technology better here under their own visibility, as opposed to research done outside the country. So it's moving, and my transition to industry came fully from an inspiration that doctors need to be closer to industry, and the kind of doctors that should be working in these kinds of roles, like I had at Abbott and now at Abiomed, are physicians who actually do the procedure and did a lot of them and struggled with it, and shed blood with our colleagues in the lab, taking care of these patients with STEMI and acute coronary syndrome and complex PCIs, and helping to improve lives, save lives, and improve the quality of life. And you have to have been in there actively involved as a technician, interventional cardiologist, doing a lot to really be able to understand what the needs are. Because now in this role, it's not my mind, it's not my ideas. I'm not telling the company what they should do. I'm just one voice, and I've been around a lot and I've had a lot of experience. But I'm now the ears of the company to all of the opinions from experts around the world in terms of what the direction of the company's this company and when I was with Abbott Vascular, the direction they should take in product development and clinical trials. And that's what you got to do. This role is all about being a good listener, assimilating all the opinions you get from the smartest people you know in the world in this field, and helping the company make the right decision.
Yes, so thanks again for sharing that piece of advice. You mentioned something in the end which I'm going to mirror just because I think it's extremely important to say it again. And these are quotes from the Dalai Lama. So the Dalai Lama has said that most of us, if we're just talking, we're basically repeating what we already know. But if we need to learn something, we need to listen. So I think that's great advice. I think it's extremely important to be a good listener for you to be a good leader, which is exactly what you exemplify and what you just shared with us. So now into your role in Abiomed. You recently joined Abiomed, and you joined at a time where there are conflicting data on the efficacy of the device, right? I mean, the papers published in JAMA and Circulation. And maybe you can comment on those. But the device has been used widely, and I have used the device as well. What do you think are the direction for or directions, if you will, for patients who present in acute myocardial infarction and are in cardiogenic shock? So the mortality from cardiogenic shock remains at a staggering 50%, despite all the advances in the last 40 years in coronary angioplasty and PCI and interventional cardiology. This is one menacing area where we really haven't made any significant dent when it comes to mortality or even clinical improvement in clinical outcomes. So I think so Abiomed has been at the forefront, for this field, in supporting the left ventricle for either high-risk PCI or in cardiogenic shock. So I think, those are obviously two different areas that I'm talking, two different subsets of patients. One is elective high-risk PCI. You want to support the left ventricle when you're performing a complex procedure. And then the other one is a patient with acute coronary syndrome and in cardiogenic shock. And those are two different subsets of patients. I understand that. So what do you think are the next steps for Abiomed's Impella in advancing care in both of these subsets of patients?
The reason that I'm in this role that I'm in, because when I left Abbott Vascular, I thought, well, now it's time at this stage of career to maybe dial back a little bit, focus on helping a couple of companies by joining the boards of a couple of small companies and then doing some consulting. And Abiomed asked me if I would come in. Mike Minogue, who's the founder, CEO, and chairman of the company that I've known for many years, found out I was out and about and could help. And so before I took this role as chief medical officer, I was working a couple of days a week just helping them with exactly what you're talking about. What is the next phase for this company to rise to the next level and actually go from being an adolescent company to a fully adult company, and one of the big guys with the kinds of data that you need to support broad use and acceptance, like a class 1 indication for the Impella. And they had already started to work on a study called Protect 4, which would be a single, multi-center, adequately powered, multi-center prospective randomized trial in high-risk PCI, so non-emergent high-risk PCI, for Impella versus any other standard of care that people consider, which is either not using any support, or you could choose to use a balloon pump, whatever your other option would be if you were treating the patient. And so that was actually one of the real hooks that got me interested in where this company is going. And then they also publicly announced they want to do the same type of huge international randomized trial in cardiogenic shock, AMI with shock. So the two categories we talked about, companies committing to two major prospective multi-center randomized trials that will achieve a class 1 indication if positive for both of those groups of patients. So, I'm like anybody who's kind of been a leader or been doing research in this field. Who wouldn't want to work with a company that's spending that kind of money, making that kind of investment to do the right thing, to come forward with the highest level of evidence possible for its technology, and also, quite frankly, take the risk of doing a large trial. I mean, Abiomed already has FDA indications for both of those categories, but they know that to make the therapy available to more and more patients who they feel, and the people who have been using Impella a lot feel deserve it, we've got to do the randomized trial. And a good example for why is MitraClip. So when I was at Abbott Vascular, I conducted or moderated Abbott Vascular's presentation to the FDA panel to get the MitraClip approved for a very narrow group indication of prohibitive surgical risk patients with primary degenerative mitral regurgitation. Even though we had really good data for secondary MR or functional mitral regurgitation, at the time of panel, the FDA would not give us the indication for that and felt that a randomized trial was needed. At that time, MitraClip was already being used in continued access studies, not under an approved indication, but continued access studies by a lot of centers. And also, we were approved in Europe, and we had a ton of data from Europe that showed that MitraClip was working extremely well for these patients with functional MR, just like they were for patients that have primary degenerative MR. But the heart failure community, FDA, everybody wanted a randomized trial. So why am I using this as an example? Because at the time, there were many people doing MitraClip who already believed it was the right thing to do for these patients. Right now, with Impella, there are tons of centers, 1,000 centers out there that already believe that Impella is the right thing to do for their high-risk PCI patients or their AMI shock patients, two categories you mentioned. But we're going to need to go through this phase of doing the randomized trial like we did with COAPT. So for secondary or functional MR, we did the study called COAPT, which I helped design along with Greg Stone, Michael Mack, and Bill Abraham. And that study took 3.5, 4 years to enroll. It was a tremendous burden, not burden, but challenge of a clinical trial. But it turned out to be probably the most positive and significant clinical trial in the history of interventional cardiology, with primary endpoint, not only a primary endpoint being highly statistically positive, but also a mortality benefit, and every single pre-specified secondary endpoint was positive. We've never had a trial like it or like COAPT before or since with that type of outcome. And it just shows you that the tediousness and the amount of attention to detail that went into that trial, with people having a lot of experience in doing MitraClip, and strict enrollment criteria on patients had to fail guideline-directed medical therapy or GDMT. And if it came back and their MR was less on GDMT, they could not be enrolled. And so the right kinds of patients got in with the right mix of LV dysfunction and MR so that we could achieve a positive primary endpoint for the benefit of MitraClip. And that's what's going to happen with Impella. And that's why when Mike asked me to take on the role of chief medical officer, even though I didn't know I'd be all back in again like I was at Abbott Vascular, I was ready to, after getting my wife's consent, to go all in again. I was ready to go back in, because this is an amazing investment. And to do a trial like this, where people already believe there's already FDA indication, people already feel that's the right thing to do, but we need the big randomized trials to move forward.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, excellent story about the COAPT. I would just go on to say that it's not only arguably one of the strongest evidences that interventional cardiology community has produced, it's also one of the strongest trials in heart failure. Like, I consider it, I equally consider it as a heart failure trial, because, those patients were on excellent background guideline-directed medical therapy, including angiotensin neprilysin inhibitors. And, the trial showed a 20%, relative risk reduction on top of the very strong, medical therapy arm, which was phenomenal. And, like you said, there were people using it, but there was a lot of clinical equipoise. And, anytime there's clinical equipoise, there's ground for debate. And then you have the naysayers, and there's always this tug of war. And, that's not good for science. It's not good for patients. That's who we work for. Our only goal is to take care of the patient in front of us and deliver the best care possible. And I think, so thanks to you. And it's a welcome move by Abiomed to actually invest the kind of money and the kind of effort it will take to get these trials, underway and on board. So, really, really happy that the company has moved in that direction and that you are at the helm leading this effort. I couldn't be happier because, even though, I'll be honest, there are patients where I felt comfortable using it because I've felt that the benefit outweighs the risk. But then there are those subset of patients where you really question, do the benefits really outweigh the risk? And the risks that I'm talking about include, large bore access and, bleeding risk, which of course with the 9 French system that you've mentioned is going to certainly mitigate that risk. And, in interventional cardiology, we're not talking about net adverse clinical events, which is becoming our leading co-primary endpoint for a lot of these trials. So, I think with all the steps that you are taking and Abiomed is taking, I think the future is very exciting.
Jump in for a second. I think the other thing that I impressed with this company, and hopefully they can show they can do it as well, is I think a lot of us would consider Edwards Lifesciences to be one of the best examples of a company, a publicly traded company that, despite the pressures of Wall Street, was able to invest both in an incredible series of robust clinical trials, Partner 1, Partner 2, Partner 3, but at the same time to invest in technology, and with every year, basically almost every year, coming out with a new SAPIEN valve. And it's hard to do both. Most of the companies out there, and they'll tell you that with you've got quarterly earnings reports, and you've got a P&L that something gets traded off. It's hard to spend in both areas the way you'd like to, both in technology pipeline and also in clinical evidence for your approved devices. But I think Abiomed is doing that as good as I've seen in any company right now, is to try to reduce those complications you mentioned. The 9 French pump will start its first in man this year. There's also we call it breaking the large bore, the small bore barrier, is an expandable sheath that will hit for the Impella 2.5 this year, and then next year the Impella CP, which is a sheath that's 9 French, true 9 French, and expandable for delivery of the pump, which is, for the CP is 14 French, but then recoils back down. It's woven nitinol design that recoils back down to 9 French. So you more or less bougie the arteriotomy rather than force a big 14 French sheath, which stays in and keeps the hole at 14 French the whole time. So we'll see where that goes. It's a novel concept, but they're investing in that type of technology to try to get at what you said, the risk benefit of using the device in patients who may need it.
Yeah, no, excellent. So any closing remarks, and, really thank you for your generosity and for your time. You're one of the luminaries I actually look up to emulate, for my career trajectory. I don't know if I'll ever be able to do that, but, certainly a role model for me personally. But any closing remarks for the podcast or for our conversation?
You just kind of do what you can in this life along work and family, and try to balance it. I probably should say most of us probably don't have in our field the best work-life balance, but you keep working at it. But I appreciate all the comments, and I hope that this has been helpful. I want to be as transparent and as accessible as possible as a CMO. A lot of people say, oh, I can't, get the email a CMO of a company for advice or whatever. But to the listeners here, just know that I've tried to be as accessible as possible throughout my career for physicians coming up, either junior partners when I was at the Sanger Clinic or in industry. So please reach out if you have a need, and I can help maybe direct folks to programs where they would maybe find they match up better or have more opportunity. But I'd encourage you to to hitch your wagon to the smartest people you know. Don't be intimidated by smart people. Be attracted by them and listen and hitch your wagon and do research with them and learn from them if this is what you want to do. And if clinical research is not your thing, this happens to have been my thing, of course, in pushing the field forward. If you just want to be a really good clinician, again, find the best clinician you know. And if you're not in a place where you feel like you've got that kind of mentorship or leadership, then I think you should find a place that does. And always keep searching for the best leaders and mentors that you can find in your career, because the last comment I'll leave you with is that's what will bring you success and fulfillment in what you do, is being open to others' ideas and finding good mentors. So I'll leave you with that.
Yeah, no, excellent closing remarks, and this is really, I think, one of the best episodes I've recorded. So thank you for your sound bites, and thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for all the advice. I'm sure it's going to be well received by a lot of us.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks
Ankur. Again for your generosity of time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dear cardiologists, we want to make this podcast about you and for you. So please email us your critical thoughts, comments and questions at podcast@radcliffe-group.com and visit uscjournal.com for more information. You can also follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook and Instagram at Radcliffe Cardiology for daily updates. Join thousands of cardiologists and become a Radcliffean by registering to radcliffecardiology.com. You will receive regular newsletters and gain access to hundreds of expert interviews, educational webinars, clinical cases, and peer-reviewed articles from our 6 medical review journals on general cardiology, interventional cardiology, arrhythmia and electrophysiology, cardiac failure, and vascular and endovascular surgery. Thank you.